Give me all the money now, the gunman screamed at the terrified cashier. Customers dropped to the floor, crying. Security cameras captured it all, but they also captured something else. An old parking attendant calmly walking toward the danger, his orange vest visible in the corner of the frame, moving with a precision that didn't match his age. What happened next would remind everyone that heroes don't always wear badges. Sometimes they wear safety vests and carry clipboards, and sometimes they've been hiding in plain sight for years. Welcome to Untold Heroes Stories. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in silence. Frank Thompson was 68 years old and completely invisible. For 3 years, he had worked as a parking attendant at the Downtown Plaza, a busy shopping center in Phoenix, Arizona. Every morning at 6 a.m., he put on his orange safety vest, grabbed his clipboard, and took his position near the main entrance. People walked past him like he was part of the scenery. Teenagers laughed at his slow movements. Business people ignored his polite greetings. Even the security guards, half his age, treated him like a harmless old man who couldn't catch a shoplifter if his life depended on it. "Morning, Frank," would call out Mike, the 25-year-old head of security, always with a patronizing smile. "Try to keep up today, old man." Frank would just nod and continue directing traffic, helping elderly customers find parking spots and picking up litter that others left behind. His supervisor, Janet Williams, often complained about his slow pace. "Frank, you need to move faster," she'd say. "This isn't a retirement home." But Frank never complained. He showed up every day, did his job quietly, and went home to his small apartment where no one knew his name or his story. In his dresser drawer, wrapped in old newspaper, was a medal he hadn't looked at in years. Next to it, a faded photo of himself in uniform, younger, stronger, wearing the badge of the Phoenix Police Department. But that was another life. Now he was just Frank, the old parking attendant who moved too slowly and talked too little. Tuesday, October 15th, started like any other day. Frank arrived at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes early as always. The plaza was quiet, with only a few early morning joggers and dog walkers passing by. The Sunrise coffee shop and Metro Bank wouldn't open until 7 a.m., but Frank liked the peaceful moments before the chaos began. At 7:15 a.m., the first wave of customers arrived. Frank took his position near the parking entrance, directing cars to available spots, helping a pregnant woman with her groceries, and reminding a teenager to slow down while driving through the lot. Inside Metro Bank, 22-year-old Sarah Chen was starting her second week as a teller. She was nervous but excited, grateful for the job that would help her pay for nursing school. The bank manager, Mr. Rodriguez, had been patient with her mistakes and encouraged her to take her time with each transaction. At exactly 8:47 a.m., 2 men in hoodies walked into the bank. Sarah looked up from her computer and smiled. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" The taller man, about 30 years old with cold eyes, didn't return her smile. His companion, younger and clearly nervous, kept looking around the bank as if counting exits. "I need to make a withdrawal," the tall man said, his voice flat. "Of course. Do you have your account information?" That's when everything went wrong. The man reached inside his jacket and pulled out a black pistol. Sarah's smile disappeared. Her training manual had covered this scenario, but nothing could have prepared her for the real thing. "Give me all the money now!" he screamed. Chaos erupted instantly. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the gun pointed directly at her face. Behind the robbers, 3 customers dropped to the floor, crying and praying. "Please don't hurt anyone," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Shut up and open the drawer," the gunman shouted. "All of it, everything." His accomplice, sweating and pacing, kept watch on the customers. "Hurry up, man, we gotta go." Outside, Frank was helping an elderly man find his car when he heard the commotion. Through the bank's large windows, he could see people on the floor. His trained eye immediately recognized the stance of the armed men, nervous, amateur, dangerous. Most people would have called 911 and waited for police. Most people would have stayed safely outside. Frank Thompson was not most people. He calmly walked toward the bank entrance, his movements deliberate and controlled. To anyone watching, he looked like a confused old man trying to figure out what was happening. But Frank's mind was already working, calculating distances, identifying threats, planning his approach. Inside the bank, Sarah's hands shook as she opened her cash drawer. Bills scattered as she tried to gather them quickly. The gunman grew more agitated with each second. "Faster! Move faster!" Mr. Rodriguez had triggered the silent alarm from his office, but police response time was still 4 to 6 minutes away. Too long. Frank reached the bank entrance and paused. Through the glass door, he could see the scene clearly. 2 armed men, 4 civilians in immediate danger, no cover, no backup. He thought of his daughter, who worried about him working at his age. He thought of his late wife, who always said he couldn't resist helping people in trouble. He thought of the oath he'd taken 40 years ago, to protect and serve. Frank opened the door and walked inside. "Excuse me," Frank said calmly, his voice carrying the authority he hadn't used in 3 years. "There seems to be some kind of problem here." Both robbers spun around. The younger one looked confused. The leader looked annoyed. "Get out, old man. This isn't your business." Frank took another step forward, his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. But his eyes were scanning everything, the gunman's grip, his stance, the distance between them, the location of the civilian. "Son, I think you're making a mistake," Frank said, his voice steady. "Why don't you put the gun down and we can talk about this?" The robber laughed harshly. "Are you kidding me? Get on the floor before I shoot you." Frank didn't move. Instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. "I've been shot before," he said quietly. "Korea, 1975. Detroit, 1982. Phoenix, 1995. It hurts, but you survive. The question is, are you ready for what happens after you pull that trigger?" Something in Frank's voice made the robber hesitate. This wasn't the scared old man he expected. This was someone who had seen violence before, someone who wasn't intimidated by threats. The younger robber was getting nervous. "Come on, man, let's just go." But the leader was fixated on Frank, angry that an old man was defying him. "I said get on the floor." Frank took another step forward. "I don't think I will." That's when the gunman made his fatal mistake. He turned the weapon away from Sarah to point it at Frank. In that split second, 40 years of police training kicked in. Frank moved with a speed that defied his 68 years. His left hand swept up to deflect the gun while his right drove forward into the robber's solar plexus. The move was textbook perfect, executed with muscle memory that never fades. The gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling as Frank twisted the man's wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. The robber gasped for air as Frank spun him around and drove him face first into the marble counter. The younger robber reached for something in his jacket, but Frank was already moving. One sharp elbow to the ribs doubled him over, and a knee to the face ended his participation in the robbery. Both men were on the ground, subdued, before anyone else in the bank fully processed what had happened. Frank calmly picked up the dropped weapon, safely ejected the magazine, and cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency. Then he pulled a zip tie from his pocket, the same kind he'd carried as a parking attendant for entirely different reasons. "Sarah," he said gently to the shaking teller, "could you call 911 and tell them we have 2 suspects in custody? Also mention that Detective Frank Thompson, badge number 2847, retired, has the situation under control." Sarah stared at him in shock. The confused old parking attendant was gone, replaced by someone who moved and spoke with unmistakable authority. You're a police officer." "Was," Frank corrected, securing the second robber with another zip tie. "Phoenix PD, 30 years, retired in 2018. The other customers slowly got to their feet, still processing what they'd witnessed. The elderly man Frank had been helping outside pressed his face against the window, mouth open in amazement. Within minutes, the parking lot was full of police cars, ambulances, and news vans. Frank sat quietly on a bench outside, back in his orange vest, clipboard resting beside him. Detective Maria Santos was the first to arrive. She'd known Frank for 15 years, had worked under him when she was a rookie. When she saw him sitting outside the bank, She thought he was just another witness. "Frank, what are you doing here?" "Working," he said simply. "I'm the parking attendant." Maria stared at him in confusion until another officer approached with his report. "Detective Santos, we have 2 suspects in custody. Bank employee says they were taken down by an off-duty officer named Frank Thompson. You know him?" Maria's eyes widened. "Frank, you didn't tell me you were working here?" "You didn't ask," Frank replied with a slight smile. News of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, local television stations were covering the story of the 68-year-old retired detective who stopped an armed robbery while working as a parking attendant. But Frank didn't want the attention. When reporters approached, he politely declined interviews. When his supervisor, Janet Williams, offered him a promotion to head of security, he thanked her but said he was happy directing traffic. The story might have ended there, forgotten after a few news cycles, if not for what happened the next morning. Wednesday morning, Frank arrived at his usual time and put on his orange vest. But something was different. As he walked toward his post, people stopped to stare, not with dismissal or annoyance, but with recognition and respect. Mike, the young security supervisor who had patronized him for 3 years, approached nervously. "Frank, I had no idea. I saw the news last night, and I just wanted to say—" "You're fine, Mike," Frank interrupted gently. "You treated me exactly how I wanted to be treated, like a regular employee. But why didn't you tell anyone? 30 years as a cop, detective rank, commendations." Frank adjusted his vest and picked up his clipboard. "Because that's not who I am anymore. I'm Frank, the parking attendant. Yesterday was just an unusual day. But the community had other ideas." Sarah Chen, the young teller, arrived at work to find a crowd gathered outside the bank. When she saw Frank directing traffic as usual, she walked over to him. "Mr. Thompson, I never got to properly thank you yesterday." "No need," Frank said. "I'm just glad everyone's okay." "No, there is a need," Sarah insisted. "You saved my life. You saved all our lives, and I found out something else about you." She handed him a printed newspaper article from 1995. The headline read, "Detective Frank Thompson receives Medal of Valor for hostage rescue." Frank glanced at the article and handed it back. "That was a long time ago. The article says you rescued 12 people from a bank robbery, just like yesterday, except you were alone and outnumbered 3-1. Frank's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his grip tighten slightly on his clipboard. "Why are you working here?" she asked softly. "You could be anywhere, doing anything. You're a hero." Frank was quiet for a moment, watching a car navigate the parking lot. Finally he spoke. "My wife died 4 years ago. Cancer. I took early retirement to take care of her. After she passed, I didn't know what to do with myself. The police department offered me consulting work, desk jobs, but I didn't want to be Detective Thompson anymore. I just wanted to be useful." He gestured around the parking lot. "Here, I help people find parking spots. I make sure they're safe walking to their cars. I pick up trash so kids don't hurt themselves. It's not glamorous, but it matters." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "You're still a police officer, aren't you? Just without the badge." Frank smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "I guess I am." Word of Frank's story spread beyond the local news. Social media picked up the story of the humble parking attendant who turned out to be a decorated police detective. Parking lot hero began trending locally. The Phoenix Police Department issued a statement praising Frank's actions and reminded the public that once a cop, always a cop. His former partner, Captain Jim Morrison, gave an interview describing Frank as the best detective I ever worked with, and an even better man. More importantly, the community around downtown Plaza began to see Frank differently. The teenagers who had mocked his slow movements now stopped to chat with him respectfully. Business people who had ignored his greetings began asking about his day. Mrs. Chen, Sarah's mother, brought him homemade lunch every day for a week. "For saving my daughter," she said, bowing formally, despite Frank's protests. The elderly man Frank had been helping find his car the morning of the robbery introduced himself as retired Army Colonel William Hayes. "I knew there was something different about you," Colonel Hayes said. "The way you moved, the way you observed everything. I just couldn't place it." "You never really stopped being a soldier," Frank replied, "or a cop." "No, you don't, and thank God for that. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from the downtown plaza management. Janet Williams, Frank's supervisor, called him into her office a week after the incident. "Frank, I owe you an apology. I've been treating you like a burden instead of recognizing your value. I want to offer you the position of security consultant full-time with a substantial raise." Frank considered this for a moment. "I appreciate the offer, Janet, but I like directing parking. I like helping people find their spots. Can I keep doing that too?" Janet laughed. "Frank, you can do whatever you want. You've earned it." Mike, the head of security who had patronized Frank for years, requested a private meeting. They sat on a bench outside the plaza during Frank's lunch break. "I've been thinking about how I treated you," Mike said, clearly uncomfortable. "All those jokes about keeping up, calling you old man. I was an ass." "You were young," Frank replied simply. "I was young once too. Made plenty of mistakes. But you never said anything. You never put me in my place." Frank unwrapped his sandwich, considering his words. "What would that have accomplished? You thought you knew who I was based on what you could see. Most people do that. The question is, what do you do when you realize you were wrong?" Mike nodded slowly. "I want to learn from you. Not just security stuff, but how to see people better." "That's good," Frank said. "Real security isn't about cameras and alarms. It's about watching, listening, understanding what doesn't belong. Most threats announce themselves if you know how to look." Over the following weeks, Mike became Frank's unofficial apprentice. Frank taught him how to read body language, how to spot potential problems before they became actual problems, and most importantly, how to treat every person with respect regardless of their appearance or position. "Remember," Frank told him one afternoon, "that confused tourist might be a retired general. That quiet janitor might be a former FBI agent. That homeless man might be a war hero who just needs someone to see him as human." Mike absorbed these lessons, and his approach to security and to people began to change. The two men Frank had apprehended were charged with armed robbery, assault, and several other felonies. During their trial, the prosecutor used security footage of Frank's intervention as evidence of how quickly the situation could have turned deadly. "If not for the actions of Mr. Thompson," the prosecutor told the jury, "we might be trying a murder case instead of a robbery." The lead robber, Marcus Williams, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. His younger accomplice, David Torres, received 8 years. But before sentencing, something unexpected happened. Torres requested to speak directly to Frank. In the courthouse lobby with his lawyer present, Torres approached Frank nervously. "Mr. Thompson, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not just for the robbery, but for what I said about you being old and slow. I was wrong about everything." Frank studied the young man, barely 20, thin, desperate-looking. "What made you think robbing a bank was a good idea?" Torres looked down at his hands. "My mom needs surgery. No insurance. I thought it would be quick and easy." "There's no such thing as easy money," Frank said quietly. "And there's always another way. What's your mother's name?" "Elena Torres. She's going to be alone now." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "I'll see what I can do." After Torres was taken into custody, Frank made several phone calls. He contacted a social worker, a local charity that helped families of incarcerated individuals, and even reached out to Elena Torres directly to connect her with medical assistance programs she hadn't known existed. "Why would you help them?" Sarah asked when she heard about Frank's efforts. "They tried to rob your bank." "Because that's what you do," Frank replied. "You help people, even when they make terrible mistakes." Despite Frank's preference for privacy, the story of the parking lot hero continued to gain national attention. Major news networks requested interviews, which Frank politely declined. A book publisher offered him a deal to write his memoirs, which he also declined. "I'm not interested in being famous," he told a persistent reporter. "I just want to do my job." But the story had already inspired others. Police departments across the country began sharing Frank's story in their training programs as an example of how law enforcement instincts never truly retire. Security companies started recruiting retired officers for positions they might have overlooked before. More importantly, communities began looking at their older workers differently. The grocery store bagger, the school crossing guard, the night janitor. People started wondering what stories these invisible workers carried with them. Frank received hundreds of letters from across the country. Some were from retired officers who felt inspired to stay active in their communities. Others were from young people who said his story made them want to pursue careers in law enforcement. One letter particularly moved him. It was from a 16-year-old girl in Ohio whose grandfather had been a police officer. "Dear Mr. Thompson," she wrote, "my grandpa died last year and I never really understood why he was so proud of being a cop. After seeing your story, I get it now. He was a protector too. Thank you for helping me understand." Frank kept that letter in his wallet next to the faded photo of himself in uniform. 6 months after the incident, life at Downtown Plaza had settled into a new rhythm. Frank still arrived at 6 a.m. and put on his orange vest, but now his role had evolved. He was officially the security consultant, but he spent most of his time doing what he'd always done, helping people. The difference was in how people saw him. Children waved when they passed. Teenagers asked about his police stories. Business people stopped to chat about their day. Sarah Chen had finished her first year of nursing school and often stopped by Frank's post to update him on her progress. "I'm thinking about specializing in emergency medicine," she told him one morning. "Something about staying calm under pressure." "You'll be good at that," Frank said. "You kept your head during the robbery. That's not something you can teach." Mike had been promoted to head of security for the entire shopping center and credited Frank's mentoring for his success. He still ate lunch with Frank every week, asking questions and learning from someone who had spent decades protecting people. Colonel Hayes had become a regular visitor, and he and Frank often discussed their service experiences. The old soldier had helped Frank connect with other veterans in the community, creating an informal network of retired military and law enforcement who looked out for each other. Even Janet Williams had become more than just a supervisor. She'd learned to appreciate Frank's unique perspective on customer service and community relations. "You know," she told him one day, "crime around the plaza has dropped 40% since you've been here. I think your presence alone makes people think twice about causing trouble." Frank shrugged. Or maybe they just don't want to mess with the old guy in the orange vest. 1 year after the robbery, Downtown Plaza held a small ceremony to honor Frank's service. They unveiled a plaque near his usual post that read, "In recognition of Frank Thompson, whose 30 years of service to Phoenix PD and dedication to community safety remind us that heroes come in all forms." Frank stood quietly during the ceremony, uncomfortable with the attention, but appreciative of the sentiment. When asked to speak, he kept his remarks brief. "I want to thank everyone for this honor, but I also want to remind you that there are heroes all around us every day. The nurse who stays late with a patient, the teacher who sees potential in a difficult student, the neighbor who checks on elderly residents. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a hero. You just need to care about other people." After the ceremony, as people gradually dispersed, Sarah approached him. "Mr. Thompson, I have something to tell you. I got accepted to the police academy." Frank's eyes widened. "Sarah, that's wonderful. But what about nursing school?" "I'll finish that too. I want to be like you, someone who protects people but also heals them. Maybe I can do both." Frank smiled proudly. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to." As the sun set over Downtown Plaza, Frank put on his orange vest one more time and walked his usual route through the parking lot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to help, new opportunities to serve. He thought about his wife, how proud she would be to see him finding purpose again. He thought about his years as a detective, the cases solved and lives saved. And he thought about the future, about young people like Sarah and Mike who were inspired to serve others. Frank Thompson had learned something important in his 68 years. Retirement doesn't mean the end of service. It just means finding new ways to make a difference. As he locked up his supply closet and prepared to go home, Frank noticed a young man loitering near the bank, watching the closing procedures with unusual interest. Old instincts kicked in, and Frank casually positioned himself where he could keep an eye on the situation. Some things never change. A protector is always a protector, whether he wears a badge or an orange vest. And sometimes that's exactly what the world needs. Today, Frank Thompson still works at Downtown Plaza. He still directs parking, helps customers, and keeps watch over his community. The only difference is that now everyone knows what they're looking at when they see him. Not just a parking attendant, not just a retired cop, but a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they're content to serve quietly, waiting for the moment when their experience and courage are needed most. Frank's story teaches us to look beyond the surface, to respect every person we encounter, and to understand that service takes many forms. The most important protection often comes from those we least expect. Have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone who seemed ordinary but turned out to be extraordinary? Someone whose quiet strength only became apparent when it was needed most? Share their story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Untold Heroes Stories for more narratives that honor those who serve without recognition, who protect without fanfare, and who remind us that the most powerful heroes are often hiding in plain sight. Because the greatest stories don't shout, they wait. Until next time, remember to look closer. That quiet person beside you might be exactly the hero the world needs.